The sea was calm that morning, almost too calm. The sound of distant waves brushed against the side of the ships, and the rising sun painted the sky with the last peace Japan would ever see. It was 1945, the empire was falling apart. Cities burned. The emperor's voice trembled behind the walls of Tokyo. And far away, deep in the Pacific, a fleet prepared for a mission no one was meant to return from. They called it the Last Convoy, a desperate attempt by the Japanese Navy to deliver supplies and reinforcements to the home islands as American submarines, aircraft, and destroyers closed in from every direction. Every sailor on those decks knew what this meant. They were not just leaving the harbor, they were leaving life itself. The commander of the convoy, Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki, stood on the deck of the battleship Yamato. The largest battleship ever built, a floating fortress of steel. Her guns could hurl shells the size of cars across the ocean. But all that power meant nothing now. Japan had no fuel left. No air cover, no hope. Yet, orders had come. Sail to Okinawa. Defend it to the last man. It wasn't a military strategy. It was a death sentence. The men didn't cheer as they departed. They stood in silence, staring at the horizon. Some clutched family photos. Others whispered short prayers into the wind. They knew America's air superiority was overwhelming. They knew every mile forward was closer to their end. Still, they went. As the engines roared and the convoy cut through the waves, the youngest sailor aboard, barely 17, scribbled in his journal, "Greater than, Mother, when you read this, I'll already be part of the sea. Don't cry, this is my duty." The Yamato led the formation, her massive hull slicing through the water like a blade. Behind her, smaller destroyers and escort vessels followed in a long, solemn line. It was a parade of ghosts. Every man aboard had accepted his fate. By noon, American reconnaissance planes had spotted them. The US Navy knew exactly what this fleet was doing, a suicide mission. Orders were sent to launch waves of aircraft. The Americans didn't intend to fight them ship by ship. They would erase them from the sky. Hours passed. The Japanese convoy pressed on. Then, a faint hum filled the air, a sound that grew louder, closer, sharper. The sky darkened with hundreds of planes. The men looked up. The time had come. Enemy aircraft, bearing north. The alarms screamed. The guns turned skyward. Anti-aircraft fire erupted, filling the sky with flames and smoke. Yamato's gunners fired until the barrels glowed red. But there were too many. The horizon was alive with metal wings. Bombs fell. Torpedoes struck. The sea exploded in fury. The ships rocked violently as water rushed in. Fire consumed the decks. Men were thrown into the air, their screams lost in the thunder of explosions. Still, they did not surrender. Damaged ships kept firing. Sailors ran through flames to reload the guns. Officers barked commands with voices trembling between courage and despair. The ocean turned black with smoke and oil. On board Yamato, Admiral Ugaki stood unshaken. His voice was calm as he gave his final order, "Greater than, do not abandon ship. Fight until the end, for Japan." His men saluted, their faces covered in soot and blood. Even as the ship tilted, even as water swallowed the lower decks, they refused to leave. A young radio operator whispered into the transmitter, his voice weak but steady, "Greater than, this is Yamato. We are still fighting. Long live the Emperor." And then, silence. Hours later, the last transmission faded. The largest battleship in history began to roll onto her side. The ocean opened its arms. With one final explosion that split the sea, the Yamato disappeared beneath the waves, taking over 3,000 souls with her. All that remained were floating debris, burning oil, and the faint echoes of duty that outlasted reason, logic, and even hope. The Americans didn't celebrate. Even they, watching from the sky, felt a heavy stillness. It wasn't victory. It was witnessing the end of something ancient, something proud, something that believed honor was worth dying for. And in that moment, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist. But the story didn't end there. Because as the smoke cleared, and the sun dipped low, survivors from the smaller escort ships floated in the water, dazed, burned, clinging to pieces of wood. They looked toward where Yamato had gone down, and they wept. Not for themselves, but for the ship that had carried their pride. The sea had claimed their empire, but not their spirit. The waves carried the last survivors of the Japanese Navy toward an uncertain shore. Some were rescued, others disappeared forever, swallowed by the dark. But among those who lived, a few would later tell the tale of Yamato and the last convoy, the day Japan chose death over surrender. When the survivors were brought to land, they were met with silence. No medals, no cheers, just quiet acknowledgement that they had done what they were told, even when it meant certain death. In a small room in Kure, a young sailor wrote his final statement before being hospitalized. His words would later become famous, greater than, "We were not fighting to win. We were fighting to remember who we were." The Yamato had been more than a ship. It was a symbol of pride, of arrogance, of devotion. Built in secret during Japan's peak of power, it represented an empire that believed itself unbreakable. But by 1945, that empire had been brought to its knees. Fuel was gone, cities were ashes, and soldiers starved on distant islands. Yet the spirit of Bushido, the warrior's way, demanded one last act of defiance. That act was the last convoy. Historians would later debate whether it was bravery or madness. But to those men, it didn't matter. They didn't fight for victory. They fought for meaning. As the war ended months later, Japan lay in ruins. The emperor's surrender message played across the nation. People knelt on dirt floors, tears streaming down their faces. The sound of his voice, soft, defeated, was something no Japanese citizen had ever heard before. And somewhere in the distance, fishermen still reported strange sightings, massive shadows beneath the sea, metal glints in the deep, where the Yamato rested. For decades, the wreck of the Yamato lay undiscovered, buried in silence. Then, in 1985, it was finally found, 1,000 feet below the surface, off the coast of Kyushu. Her hull was split, her guns frozen in the direction they last fired. Inside that steel tomb were thousands of men who had once believed they were saving their nation. When Japanese divers visited the site, they brought flowers. They didn't speak, they simply floated above the wreck, staring at the rusted remains of a dream that had gone too far. One diver later said, "Greater than, it felt like they were still down there, watching us." The sea was the grave, but also their peace. In modern Japan, the Yamato has become more than a warship. She is a reminder of sacrifice, of loss, and of the dangers of pride. Her story is told not to glorify war, but to remember the cost of it. Even today, on the anniversary of her sinking, veterans and families gather by the shore. They light lanterns and set them afloat, letting them drift across the dark water. The tiny lights move together, flickering like the souls of those who never came home. An old veteran once said, watching those lanterns fade into the horizon, greater than, they didn't die for victory. They died believing they could protect what they loved. Maybe that's what makes it beautiful, and tragic. The waves keep moving, the world keeps forgetting. But the ocean remembers. Every sound of the tide against the rocks, every echo beneath the water's surface, it carries the memory of that final convoy. The mission that was never meant to succeed, but was carried out anyway, because some hearts would rather break than surrender. As the narrator's voice fades, imagine standing at the shore of Japan, staring into the endless sea. Somewhere out there, beneath miles of dark water, rests the pride of an empire, the ship that refused to bow. And if you listen closely, you might still hear the whisper of those who went down with her, greater than, for honor. For Japan. For the sea that never forgets.